again to Watercolours with Caroline, and this week we're going to paint a rooster. Sort of follows on from last week, similar method to the cats, but not quite so wet in wet. And I've based the rooster and the cats on paintings by Endre Penovac, a Serbian painter who's just an expert in these subjects. And he paints them beautifully wet in wet on slightly bigger paper than I'm using and a bigger brush. So we're just trying to emulate his style, and on smaller paper. I've got 5x7-inch paper, Arches 140-pound cold pressed, and using pretty much my usual colors. So grab your paintbrush and some paint and follow along. I've got my little rooster ready, and I read my directions 2 more times last night to remember what I did, and I'm going to have to look at them again. So what I want to do is get the colors ready because we're going to do, the wet in wet, but not as wet as with the white cat, so that we it's not as out of control. So first of all, we're going to mix up some dark color for the background with the same colors we use for the cat dark background, the ultramarine blue, the burnt sienna, the sepia, and the Payne's gray. Now, the reason like last week, I said I use those colors because they don't stain too badly. We can lift them afterwards. We can lift them when we're painting, and we don't have to worry. You can lift up quite a bit of white using those colors. So I've still got last week's cat colors here, so I can wet that up a little bit and get it ready. And add, of course, some more pigment. So I'll start with my ultramarine blue and some Payne's gray. And some sienna and sepia. And of course, if you don't have sepia, then you can use burnt umber or Van Dyke brown. Any dark brown is fine. There we go. We got some good dark mixture. I also want to have some ultramarine blue ready because it's nice to have patches in the background of just ultramarine blue. Just mixing wet in wet with your other colors. And I'm going to get some burnt sienna ready. And my burnt sienna is kind of mixing on top of a bit of a messy mix here, but that's okay. I'm going to have 3 nice dark colors to work wet in wet for the dark colors in the background when I get there. And here I want to have some raw sienna for the light parts of the bird. I got some raw sienna. Now the beak, although beaks, we think of them as yellow, they really are much more raw sienna-y colored. So we're going to use that for the beak. And clean my brushes. And of course, you need a very tiny brush for the beak. Oh, and the other one I want to get ready is the bright red for the coxcomb and everything on the birds. So I'll get my other palette. And I'm going to use cadmium red, but any of those bright reds will do, like scarlet, or I have another one, Pyrrole Red, Windsor Red. They're all just something nice and bright for the really bright parts on the coxcomb and the head. I'll get my cadmium red ready. I'm also going to get a little bit of yellow ready in case I want to add a bit of yellow to the leg, the beak, or the head with my Pyrrole Red. Right. So we're going to start on dry paper, and we're going to start with the beak and the legs, and I'm just picking up my number 2 brush, so a nice little brush for this, and with my raw sienna start with the tiny, tiny parts, which are the beak. Because I work small to save money on paper and to save time for painting. But if anybody wants to work bigger than this, you can. It's okay. I put the little beak in and the legs. And where I come to the top of the leg, where it meets the feathers, zoom in a little bit. I'm going to start there with little brush strokes that look like the feathers are coming over the legs. So it's not just a line where that starts. I'm going to put the front leg in first, so it's a little bit brighter. Tip of my brush. And there's a highlight down the side of the leg. So I'm just going to take a little bit of that paint up with my brush, just absorb a little bit. And I could put a little drop of water where the leg meets the feathers, just to blur that line a little bit. Now the back leg would be a little less bright. So you can mix either Cobalt Blue or Ultramarine Blue with, I've got my raw sienna here. I'm going to take a little bit of my Ultramarine Blue and I'm going to take it over here. I'm not going to mix it with all my raw sienna because I might want some later. But I want to just make a slightly darker raw sienna over here with a little bit of blue in the mix to make it a little bit more gray, a little bit more dark for the back leg. And I'm going to put the back leg in. Now, the thing to watch is if you touch the front leg with the back leg paint, it's going to zoom into the front leg too. So I'm going to leave a little border of white paper unpainted, which I can fill in later with a little bit of shadow. Or you can paint both the same color and put the shadow on later. That's another method. Either way will work. And put that back leg in. Again, there's a little bit of highlight on the back of the leg. I'm just going to absorb a little bit of that paint. That's fairly little delicate painting. Get all my Kleenex and my cloths ready for dabbing up any paint. So we don't want to do the coxcomb until the beak is dry, but we can use that raw sienna. If you look at the neck, the most raw sienna place on this rooster is sort of under here, under the wattles or whatever they're called, and just here. So we can put, just using your raw sienna and water, of course, so it's not too strong. We can start to put, going in the direction of the feathers, we can start to put a little bit of that shading. Now start with the most, not the most, the darkest place, which is right under here, so that you can kind of test if you've got your raw sienna dark enough. Of course, you can always put more on later. And the feathers go down the neck. So pull, as you paint, pull your brush strokes downwards so they're going in the right direction. And you can really sort of make sure you get a nice edge when the paper's dry. Just leave the top of the head white. Even if it does show a little bit of raw sienna in the photo, it's nice to have the drama of the white against. We're going to put a dark background on there. The place where it's darkest is at the front. The light in the photo that I have seems to be coming from the side and the back, so we'll keep the front darker. and slowly bring these down. And so that I don't have everything linear, I'm going to get some just clean water and just put clean water on a little part here and here so that I have two types of brush stroke going on. A very crisp linear brush stroke and then that kind of wet in wet blurred look as well. Now the way to get a looser brush stroke is to use a much bigger brush. So I'm going to switch to my number 8 and I want to get some sort of blurred shadow on the chest. And I don't want that blurred shadow to be too linear. So I'm going to wet the chest and outside of the chest so that some of my color might blur out into the background, but that's okay because we're going to go in with some pretty dark background. So we're not going to worry too much. We're going to hope that we get a little bit of blurring there. And also wetting this area is going to keep our brush strokes nice and wet and loose. Don't want to wet everything, just sort of this area, and carefully this time, not so much like the cat where we wet the whole, the whole paper. This is more controlled. And this is just my version of how to do that sort of method that Endre Penovac does. I can't be that loose. So I still have some raw sienna, and I'm going to put, first of all, a little bit of that on the chest. And just coming down the leg a little bit and under this wing. We're going to put more shadow under the wing later. I'm going to start with a little bit of this raw sienna. Wash my brush out. And then we're going to use the Ultramarine Blue mixed with the raw sienna. I'm going to mix. I've still got my two little puddles here. I'm going to mix a little bit more Ultramarine Blue with that raw sienna to get a gray color. And while this is still wet, I want to add a little bit of gray to this chest and this leg. And hopefully, if I'm adding this wet in wet with the very tip of my brush, I'm going to get that soft feathery look that I'm after. This leg here I left dry, so I can get quite a sharp edge just here. And I don't want to go right up to the edge here. I want to have a bit of white showing here. And then I have my pure Ultramarine Blue just here. So I'm going to get a little bit of that. And right on the front of the wing in the photograph, there is some very blue color. So I'm going to drop in, that should be wet still. Just drop in a little bit of that Ultramarine Blue. And also a little bit to the chest, just a tiny bit. This is where you have to be very, very controlled with your brush strokes and not get too out of control with them. Now there is showing a little bit of shadow under here on the photograph. I don't want to have too much shadow there, so I'm going to wet this area and take the tiniest bit of Ultramarine Blue, just a tiny bit, and just add a little bit of shadow there. And I got really, really tiny bit of Ultramarine Blue. I'm going across here now with the tip of my brush just to show some feather sort of streaks there. And I've got a little bit of a watermark here, which I'm not worried too much about because I'm going to put a lot of dark background, but I just want to ease that watermark in a little bit. We should have most of the shadow on the body. We can put a little bit on the tail, actually. I'm looking at my photograph and just coming up to the tail here and on the one that I did. There's a little bit of shade here. So again, we can use the ultramarine blue or the ultramarine blue with a little bit of raw sienna to put that little bit of shade in. And I'm going to put it in on dry paper. I'm just going to use ultramarine blue for the moment. And again, following the feathers kind of come up and around. Our very, very last thing we do, will be the big dark tail feathers. So keep those in mind as you're doing this. And I'm just going to put that little bit of direction going up into those feathers. And again, I'm going to take a wet brush and on this side of the paint strokes, just add a little bit of water so it's softer where it comes from the body and harder lines going up into the tail. A little bit of modeling into the wing here. And wet brush and pull that in. Now the neck, my neck's just about dry. So again, I'm going to take a little bit of I have my ultramarine and raw sienna. Oops, I'm under the camera. Ultramarine and raw sienna mix here. It's a little bit. And I want to put a little bit of shading on the head. Just here. I think the ear is there on the rooster. And you can see a little bit of a dip in the head there. And I should get my smaller brush. I'm still working with my number 8. I'm going to go back to my number 2, so I got a little bit more control. Put a little bit more shade coming down here. And a wet brush. I'm going to blur that in with a wet brush. And there, and then all of that is not too wet and wet, so it gives us some good working time to go back to other areas. And if I touch the beak, this beak is fairly dry, so the next place we could work on is the coxcomb on the top of the head. And we want to make sure that this is a really, really lovely, bright red, even brighter than the photograph. Now, the photograph, of course, has been downloaded and then put onto photocopy paper, so it's probably not anywhere near as beautiful and bright as it would have been. I've used a much brighter red for mine, and there's 2 or 3 layers. There's a second layer and a third layer. So red is a color that dries much lighter, so we might need to go in for 2 or 3 layers. So I got my red here, my little brush again. Make sure I have not too much paint. And I'm going to go very carefully, pointing the point of my brush up into those little areas that stick up. And coming around the beak One thing I like to do, not always, I don't always do it, but I kind of find it helps the red and look like the sun shining through the top of the head, is I put a little bit of yellow on. Now mine's Azo Yellow. You can use Cadmium Yellow or Permanent Yellow. And to put that on so it's a little bit lighter in places, I'm going to connect the two. I have the red on my brush again, and I'm going to let the red run into that yellow that I've put on there. I can control it with my brush. If I want to pull it back a little bit, take the tip of my brush and control it. Oh, it's really flooded into the yellow, but that's okay. And still pull a little bit back with the tip of my brush, and the yellow's always going to be there mixed with that red on the paper. Sometimes you can, of course, if you've got a much bigger piece of paper, you can really control the yellow and the red. If they're still wet, they're still wet. So I'm just going to dab a little bit of yellow in while they're still wet and let it flood back into the red. It's just like when you do a water run like we did on the white cat last week. If you put something that's wetter into wet paint, it will push it backwards if you just do it at the right time. Paint has to be just the right consistency. And now I really feel like I've got that kind of like orangey look at the back and the darker red look at the front. I can get some more red and put these areas in. Now, when we start off, these two get painted together, but of course they're separate. We'll separate them with shadow later after they're dry. I'm going to get a little bit of yellow and do the same thing, and put a little bit of yellow in here. And just let that mix on the paper. If you mix them in your palette, these two colors, you don't very often get an orangey red. The red takes over in your palette and you don't get that subtle mixing of red and yellow and orange that you get just mixing them on the paper. And that lovely kind of wet in wet look. That one worked out a little bit better. They didn't flood into each other. The red wasn't quite as wet, but I still like the look at the top where I got a flood backwards with the yellow. It's never going to work the same. However many times you do it, it's always going to be different. Now you can either paint right over the eye and come back and put it in with black pen or black paint later, or you can go around it. Now the reason there's a white piece here, so you have to go around the white piece carefully. Little white piece on the head. The reason I've shown a little bit of my eye is because I think I'm going to lose my pencil marks if I go right over it. The other way to not lose them and go right over it is to use a very fine black pen and actually put the eye in first before you paint. If you're worried you're going to lose where it is, that works just fine too. Bit late for me now because I've already put paint on, but I think if I just carefully go around it, I will find it later. And of course, there's that little white patch on the side of the face. And while I have some red on my paintbrush, I want to do a tiny bit of red on the leg because there is some very warm color on the leg. There's shadow behind and between the toes here, just on the front leg because warm colors come forward. And now I've got that on there, I'm going to use my wet brush to just soften that in. And I have my yellow as well. I'm just going to add a little bit of yellow to that to get some vibrant color on that front leg. Wet in wet. There is that pattern on the leg too. Do that later when this is all dry. Another great color for the legs is burnt sienna because it is that orangey brown. Got a little bit of burnt sienna on my brush and just pull that along the back of the leg there and between the toes. And also this back leg can have a little bit of burnt sienna on it, just to give it some shadow. And soften that in. Let's get my wet brush and just soften it in a little bit. And I'll mute you for a minute. So we're going to have to work like carefully. And the idea is to have like next to the lighter chest and lighter areas is to go dark. And then when we have the light tail, we want to go lighter. So we're going to wet all around the rooster so that we've got time to work. And then, you know, put in different colors. And it doesn't matter if we have this blotchy look to the background where we've got backgrounds where we can put in extra water if we want it lighter, if we've got color against color. We're kind of going for that look where the rooster is very clean looking, lots of controlled brush strokes, and the background is more sort of lots of wet in wet. So you can see maybe here I've got ultramarine blue and then I've got the browns coming into it. I put water to lighten it up here and so forth, much darker under the rooster. And we haven't put any of the grass or anything in, just dark under the rooster. So remember we mixed up all of this dark paint, the blacks, the blue, the brown. And our next job is to wet the background. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can show that. Now I have to be very careful wetting the background because you don't want to wet any areas of the rooster that you want to keep nice and clean and white. So, and also if there's areas where you would like a little bit of the background to bleed into the rooster, you can always wet that a little less carefully. But definitely around the legs, I want to be pretty careful. And wetting the whole background means that you have much more time to work with your background colors. You don't have to rush as fast. It gives you more time to think. And sometimes it really helps to turn the paper to get close to the areas that you're wetting. Of course, where I'm not close to the rooster, I can wet it much more quickly with bigger brush strokes. And then when I get close to the rooster, I need to be much, much more careful. I'm going to have to turn it so I can get to it from the other side. And the red will probably bleed out into the water. That's okay. We'll have a lovely wet and wet look, and we're going to put another layer on the coxcomb anyway. The tail, we're going to come over with dark paint. Now you need to kind of tilt your paper to see if you've got it all wet. And I'm going to go back to the beginning. Probably where I started is starting to dry a little bit. So I'm going to put a little bit of extra water on that area because I want to make sure that nothing dries up too fast as I'm working. And let's start with the lightest areas first. So the lightest areas are going to be around the tail. That's going to be dark. See, if we have dark around the tail and dark tail, it won't show up. I'm going to take just a little bit of ultramarine blue, and I'm going to start just close to the tail with the lightest colors that I'm going to put into the background. And I'm going to kind of shape them around the tail, just so that if they flow back into the tail, they flow back in a sort of a feather pattern. So it looks like it's shadow. And ultramarine blue is a lovely color in the background. So I'm going to put some up here, even though I'm going to bring dark into that ultramarine blue, and some over here because I'm going to bring dark into it. But it is a beautiful color and it will granulate with the other darks. I got the blue on. Now I'm going to switch. I've got here number 8 brush. No, I'll stick with my 8. I was going to switch to a 6. I'm going to stick with my 8 and go into my dark mixture that we used for the black cat and the dark background on the white cat. And I'm going to turn it again because I want to be careful how I put my darks in and come up next to the chest. And I'm just going to let that flow out into the water and into the ultramarine blue. And now a little bit of the burnt sienna. And I'm going to take that in the corner here. And burnt sienna up here. I want to have a mix of background colors. In the corner here. And then back to my dark. And very, very carefully around the beak. I don't want to lose the pointiness of the beak or the pointiness of the cockscomb sticking up. So got to be a little bit careful. If you put all of your pigment close to the rooster and just let it flow out into the wet area, it should be fine. I'm going to turn, I have to turn it, otherwise I'm going to get my hand in all of this wet paint. And now I really do need my small brush. I'm going back to my number 2 brush and my dark sort of gray black mixture. And I have to be very, very careful as I come in here. Just pointed the brush in there. Now I'm just breathing and not speaking too much while I do that. And just here, and put in a little bit more ultramarine blue just here. I just want a different color change. Behind the head, I want it to be much, much lighter, and I'm going in first. I'm going to mix. No, I'm not going to mix. I'm going to take, remember that mix we started with? We had some raw sienna and ultramarine blue. And take that gray mix and very, very lightly go in behind the head with that light gray mix that I made it right at the beginning. And I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue to that gray mix and water so that it's not too dark. And come in along the back of the rooster. Still needs to show up, but not be quite as dark as some of the other places. And like I said, it's going to look very watery, wet and wet, a little strange. You can tip it if you want to get a little bit of mixing happening. I'm just tipping mine to mix it a little bit more. And I've said many times about the corners of paintings, they should be darker. They should have dark in them. So I'm going to get some more of my dark mix, and everything is drying. So what's happening is I'm not getting a wet and wet mix here because everything's drying. I have to try and force some wet and wet happening. And I can also force background with water. I can put some water in here and deliberately force a background rather than having a dry edge happening. Which is way better to have a controlled background water droplet is better than having a dry edge coming up against a dry edge, and you're never going to be able to get rid of that dry edge look. It will always be there. Now it's drying quite quickly down here too. So as I bring the dark mix in down here, I'm going to have to work a little bit quicker now because I can sense everything's drying up. Little space between the legs, little brush. And definitely want to get that dark against the light body here. And I'm gathering burnt sienna on my brush and my dark gray mix. So I dipped my brush in the burnt sienna and then I dipped it in the dark gray, dark, almost black mix. I'm gonna bring that down. Again, my corner's a bit too light, so I have to quickly get some dark in that corner. And right here by the tail, the paper is really, really drying fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to force another deliberate back run by putting some water here and letting it just back run into the paint that I've got. At the same time, I can use my thirsty brush to work it in a little bit. And remember, my dark tail feathers are going to come out into this light area, so that's going to be fine. I can also, at this time, I can push some of these dark lines up like this to form white feathers coming down into the, it's going up into the dry rooster there. Now, you have to be very careful because there's going to reach a point where it's all going to be too dry to do anything more with your background. And if you can see everything starting to go dull, it's too dry. If it's still a little bit shiny, I can see it's still a little bit shiny, I can still add a little bit of paint there and it might bloom, but I'm not worried because that's kind of a look I'm going for. I can still add a little bit of paint where it's still a little bit shiny. And if I want to, I can even add, like I'm adding like a little bit of texture by putting just tiny dots of burnt sienna in there. And it will look darker right now than when it's finally dry. Well, I apologize. Zoom had a bit of a moment there and kicked me off of Zoom and corrupted my video. So I'm going to record the rest of it after Zoom on my other camera. So it'll maybe sound and look a little bit different. And I want to go back to doing the background because when I did it on Zoom yesterday, this was my background and it was really quite dark. It was like the first one that I did. And the second one that I did was much lighter, and I really think I prefer the lighter background. So I have got, in this background, I've got some raw sienna and some cobalt blue and some of the grey, but I didn't go as intense as this background. So you can make a decision if you've been following along and you did the other one, like, oops, I'm sorry. Didn't really realize till after we had a bit of a breakdown with Zoom. But anyway, let's try the lighter background. It's the same method of wetting the whole background first. And this time I'm going to wet the chest area a little bit to see if I can get a little fluffy look, just for a different kind of look. And I especially want to stay nice and light around the tail feathers so the dark shows up. And when it's all dry, again, I put the same shadow in that you missed, I think, because it all broke down on me. So let's get some clean water and a bigger brush for wetting and a small one for getting in where the feet are. So I'm sorry, I'm going to go through that bit again. Maybe I'll pause while I do the wetting so you don't have to watch that whole wetting part again, okay? There, I saved you having to watch that over again. So this time I am going to go much, much lighter, and I want to start with the raw sienna. And remember, I've got wet paper, so I can go a little bit stronger with my raw sienna. And I want to put that sort of in a few places. Not just one place, because you always need to have some balance happening. And burnt sienna will go beautifully with that. And I would get some burnt sienna. And of course, if I put the ultramarine blue and burnt sienna on, I will get some nice granulation happening as well. And I have to be careful that I keep my darks where I want darks and lights where I want lights. A little bit in the corners still. And I probably will have to turn my paper to get it to go in the right direction and not flood into areas that I don't want it to. So now I'm mixing up my burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to make that lovely grey that I love. And I have to say they are two of my favourite colours and my favourite mix. And you might notice I don't change my colours all that often for something brighter or different. There's two reasons for that. One is I am just so used to how these colours behave that I know I can mix them quickly and I know how to use them because I use them all the time. The second thing is because, you know, you're my students and I've advised you on what colours to buy, and I haven't advised you to buy all the extra colours, so I don't want you having to search for colours you don't have too. So I've mixed up my dark ultramarine and burnt sienna. So I'm going to put some of that close to this chest here, which I made wet, so I'm going for more of a fluffy chest look. And I've also mixed up some ultramarine blue, so I can just have some ultramarine blue if I don't want the grey. And the ultramarine will look really nice next to the red too. Now, of course, if I've got the wet chest here, looking for the fluffy chest look, I do have to put the water in there to push the paint back because Otherwise it's just going to take away my lovely white chest. So I have to be very careful with this area too. I'm flooding it with a bit of water to push that paint back so I don't lose the white chest there. A little bit of a tricky thing, and I didn't try it with the other one. I wanted a bit more control for me and for you. I've switched to I've got my number 6 brush, which is probably even a little bit too big. I'm going to grab my number 2 brush because I'm going around in here where it's going to be a little more tricky to get in close. Oh, I want to just get in here. And the red is bleeding out into the water a little bit, and that's okay. I love the bled look of the paint, especially for something like this, where we're going for a bit more of a loose look. As I come down the back of the Rooster, I do want to be more dark where the back is white, so that the white back shows up. And I have to keep switching brushes, need a bigger brush. I'm going with some Cobalt Blue for near the tail, so that it's quite a bit lighter. Just dabbing my brush, because I'm going to have that dark tail coming out into the lighter background. So blue down here before it dries, or blue-grey mix actually. Will be more shadow down here to ground the Rooster, put a little bit of shadow underneath him. And right here I left this dry so I can shape a few of the feathers. And then I need to go dark down the back of the neck. And the back here, I just want that dark there so that shows up. Going into either Cobalt or Ultramarine here, so it's a little bit lighter. Now you have to work fairly fast because you're working wet in wet, and anytime you're working wet in wet you're having to be very careful that your paint's not drying up. The only thing you can do when it starts to dry up is to add water, like I did for the other one. I added some water here to get sort of that bloom and that back run, deliberate bloom and back run. Or if it's not too dry yet, you can always add a little bit more color, but you have to be very careful how you do both of those things. Because this is a real wet in wet painting, having some of those blooms and back runs are fun. They're kind of part of it. I'm adding water here to force a bit of a back run. It worked better on my other one. You never know quite how it's going to work. You could be pretty scientific about it and you know, time it all and figure it out. You just have to do it a few times to get the feel for that. My other one worked better because I had darker paint on the other one and I was trying to lighten it up. So I just want to pull that down there, and I don't want to lose my white chest. The back run needs a bit more work here for I wanted a soft fluffy chest happening. Again, I might need to be a little bit more scientific with when I put that water in there. It has to be as the first layer of paint is starting to dry. I always manage to paint my shirt like this, but hasn't quite, you know, reached that dry point yet. So you've still got enough moisture in your paint that you've put down that you can move it with the water. And whenever I'm teaching, I'm a little bit more impatient because I don't want you to be sitting around just watching paint dry. I can use my Kleenex to dab a little. I did notice when I was watching the Endre Penovac video on YouTube, he had a Kleenex handy to dab. He had his brushes handy to add water backgrounds. He did all of those little tricks with his, so that was kind of fun to watch. Now, I wasn't very happy with some of those areas. They weren't dark enough, so I dried it with a hairdryer, which is really important before you go on. And I've mixed up a few more dark colours, and I want to get darker here so that this area shows up much more. Now, if you're putting more colour onto the background, you can't just wet where you want to put more colour, otherwise you're going to get really big ugly watermarks happening. You have to wet the whole thing again, even if you don't put more paint on the other areas, just to avoid having a watermark happening. And trust me, you will not like the watermark if it does happen, because you'll have like a line, just a dry line where things meet and don't blend. So I wanted it to be a little darker at the rear of the rooster, and I did forget this little piece between his two legs here. I didn't wet that piece because it's so tiny it would be hard to control, and it's between two dry pieces of paint, so not so critical to wet. Now, paper is actually drying up very fast this time. You know, it's probably still warm from the hairdryer, so I have to work pretty fast. And I'm going to turn that. I didn't like how the water bloom happened from the chest. I didn't get it going right. I think this painting's just too small for that, so I'm going to work on dry paper and clean that area up a little bit. I had to wet that a little bit more because it really is drying. You can actually see right here. I hope you can see anyway. I'll zoom in, you can see a little better. Right here, it's fairly dry and it was resisting the paint flow, and I will, if I'm not careful with a little bit of wet paint and water, I will end up with a dry line there, which I won't like. Tidy up this area, and you can almost sort of see the water line around the head where I didn't wet too carefully this time, because I didn't think I would be up here around the head. I'm not worrying about it, but I think I need a little bit more shadow here, and I'm going to have to use, whoops, and then I'll get a back run there. But like I said, we're doing sort of back runs and interesting things with this one anyway. So it's always possible to do a second layer. You just have to make sure that everything is wet before you go in and do that second layer. Otherwise you're not going to be happy with it. Right, so I'm going to let that soak in. Before you go to the hairdryer, it's always important to let the paint soak in, and other things are important too. So to make these feathers here sort of hang down from the body like they do, you can push the tip of your little paintbrush up in there to shape those feathers. And of course we're going to have the dark feathers coming out here to give some shape, and I've got dark on my brush, so I can put a little bit of that shadow in while I have some dark on my brush. And the rooster is dry, so I've got to be careful. I have to be really careful not to get my wrist into the painting, which is why I don't want to do too much more until I get this area dry. One other thing I want to point out is that I used my 01 Pigma black pen to just do a little bit of detail around the eye and the beak. So because it's such a small painting, it's really, really difficult to do any good detail. A little bit of dark in there. To do good detail with a brush. I will add a tiny bit of darker. The eye is kind of a brownish red colour with a black pupil. And again, try not to get my wrist in. So I've got the black in with the pen, and I've just used a little bit of brown and dark red to put what would be the iris in there. We've got a little bit more to do. We've got some speckles on the neck feathers, some sort of speckles on the chest and the tail feathers, and then we'll bush out with some really lovely tail feathers. I'm going to dry mine before we do that. So I'm going to need some colors for the tail and for the speckles and some of the shadows. So what I have here is the Ultramarine Blue and the Burnt Sienna. So I want to add a little bit more Burnt Sienna to that to make it more brown. And a more warm brown. And over here I want to get some sepia with some Burnt Sienna and a little bit of Ultramarine Blue to make a much darker brown. And not too much water. Notice I'm not cleaning my brush between going into these paints. And I know maybe you think, oh, that's awful for your paints, but I can clean up my paints later. But I don't want to add too much water to my paint, because if I do, it's not going to be dark and it's going to run all over the place and not be helpful to me at all. So let's get that there. Now I've still got some Ultramarine Blue there, and I will need some little bit of raw sienna. I'm actually going to mix the raw sienna with some Burnt Sienna for just in the chest area. So a little bit of raw sienna, a bit of Burnt Sienna, just to darken that raw sienna up. And you know, I'm going to take another way to just grey it down and darken it up a little bit is to take a little bit of Ultramarine Blue or Cobalt Blue, either one, and just add that. Just takes it away from that bright colour, gives us a little bit of shadow. We want some shadow under the beak area. So I have some colours ready. Let's put little Rooster back over here and get my paintbrushes. Right, there, organised. And I'll zoom in so you can see better. So we want to put under the I think they're called wattles here. We want to have some shadow and we want some little speckles. Let's go back to the photograph. So you can see under here is a little bit of shadow, and then on the neck some speckles, and then this is sort of raw sienna here. Now let's start there with a small brush. I'm just going to get my number 2 to start with, and because it's very small shadows. And right under here I have the raw sienna with the Burnt Sienna and a little bit of blue mix, and coming downwards because the feathers come down the neck, I'm going to pull those shadows down. And I always want to have the picture to look at to make sure I've got things going accurately. And it's quite shaded on this side, and they kind of come round here, round the neck. A little bit of shadow here, a little bit behind the ear, and I'm going to leave the top of the head white. There's this white patch right here I'm going to leave. And while I've got my little paintbrush, I have my red, and I'm going to mix a little bit of Ultramarine Blue with my red to make it slightly darker, because I want to have this side darker than the other one. I'm going to put the shadow on a little bit more Ultramarine Blue with that red. See, I want to go slowly, not too much. Right under the beak is fairly dark. If you look at the photograph, there's a dark patch there. There's also a dark fold right here. I've drawn it in with the little pen, but I now want to put some of it in with paint. And right here there's some little creases, and around the beak is quite dark, around the eye, and some little wrinkles right here. And just put those in to give it a little bit of form and shape and shade to all those areas. This part it hangs right over the beak, and it's a little bit shaded, so I'm going to put a little bit of shadow right there too. There's some wrinkles on its face there. The more I look, the more I see, but I want to put too much in. It's you know, I'm not trying to go super realistic. I'm going to add a little bit of brown to that dark color and put just a shadow on that back leg. And you can either use the pen or your little paintbrush to put that little pattern that's on the legs. Just generally kind of put it in. You don't have to be super realistic. Again, we're not going for really realistic painting. Now with my little tiny brush now, I've got that the sort of rich brown that I made with the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and I want to do some of these little speckles that are on the neck feathers, so I have to be kind of careful you don't go too big with them. I've got my Kleenex and I'm just taking a little bit of the paint off of my brush so it's not too full of paint, and I put these speckles in. They kind of come down in a line like this. There's some, I can just see some under here, and a little shadow just there and here maybe. The more I use my brush, the more paint comes off of it, and the smaller I can make these dots then. It's kind of like using a dip pen. As you start to run out of ink, you can get finer and finer lines. And we don't want to overdo anything. There's also some dark feathers showing on the breast of the rooster here. There are very few of them, but they're here and there, and especially some on the edges of the wings here. And we can actually show the edge of the wing by putting some of those dark feathers showing just on the edge of the wing. The other thing I've put under the wing is a little bit of brown shadow that I've made very soft by wetting that shadow, and I can't quite remember where I got to when the Zoom video broke on me and wouldn't do anything, just wouldn't cooperate. It actually said it had lost all of the video, but I managed to recover some of it this morning that it hadn't downloaded. Now I'm going to get a little bit of ultramarine blue as well. You can use cobalt blue or ultramarine blue, or a little bit of cerulean if you want some different blues to just put some fluffy little feathers on the chest here and a little bit of shadow. I'm not going to put as much as they have in the photo because that's going to make everything too dark in a small painting. A little bit of shadow here down this leg, and show some direction of the feathers. Now right on the edge of the wing here, it's quite blue, and I want to use, just to have a different brighter blue, I want to use a little bit of cerulean here. Now, so I'm putting the cerulean on, and then I'm going to get a wet brush. I'm going to really just like wet the brush all around that to make it messy. Just want a messy look. There's also a little bit of shadow going up into the tail feathers and around. You can show the direction of the tail feathers by just pushing your brush strokes up that way, and then wetting one side of those brush strokes so it's soft where it leaves the body, and then harder line where it becomes the individual tail feathers. Now I have raw sienna on the beak. If you feel you want your beak to be a little bit more interesting, you can add either Quinacridone Gold if you have some, if you can afford it, one of those really expensive colours, which I'm just going to use, or you can use a yellow, or you can just leave it the colour that you have it. I've got a little bit of Quinacridone Gold on the feet, another great colour for the legs, of course, for shadow is the burnt sienna, that lovely orangey brown. Give them some beautiful colour. So I've got a lot of colours in there. Actually, I've got a little bit of the red that I used, the raw sienna, some burnt sienna, some of the dark brown, and now a little bit of Quinacridone Gold, just because I have some. And that's what I mean. I don't use those expensive colours I have very often, because I know most of you don't have them. But I have done about 5 of these now, and it's time to branch out a little bit. I'm going to get another little bit of Quinacridone Gold on my brush. I'm going to put that on the neck feathers just a little bit, wet it in, and it will blur those dots a little bit, make them a little bit less in your face. And it's just given my 5th or 6th rooster a little bit more interest. You don't always have to use the colours that I suggest. You can branch out on your own and go a little bit wild. I used Cadmium Red for the coxcomb, but I'm going to get some of my Pyrrole Red. And I want to just sharpen up some of these areas where I went in a little bit too harsh with the... Oh, not really. I just blended in the background colour, and I want to now overpaint with the red. So I've got some really lovely red glowing. And again, Quinacridone Gold is really good at pushing other colours away. So I'm going to drop a little bit of that into... It'll push that red back a little bit and golden up the coxcomb. Now all we have left is the base here, a bit of shadow, and the tail feathers. So let's do the base first. This was my favourite shadow that I did. It's Ultramarine Blue, and then a little bit of the burnt sienna mixed with a little bit of the red that I used to warm it up. Done really quick and fast, big brush, and don't fuss too much. Like, the more you fuss with something, the worse it gets, the more it looks contrived. So I'm going to start with my Ultramarine Blue, and I got my size 8 brush because I don't want to fuss, and a big brush will help stop that. I'm not all I want to do is put some shadow under this rooster. I just want to be careful that it doesn't go over his feet. I don't want a clean edge to anything. I want it to be this kind of like anywhere at the edge. It's sort of like his body, under his feet. And now I'm going to get some of that Pyrrole Red and the burnt sienna to make a very warm shadow here. A little bit of water to help just melt it all in. And then listen to my own advice and don't fuss with it. Like, don't keep fussing. Don't keep trying to make these edges perfect or straight or finish in a dead line or something. Just, you know, just let it be what it is. I want to just get a little bit closer to the feet and fuss with it like I told you not to. But the lovely thing is the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue, they granulate together and they mix together beautifully. They really play well together, those two colours. And that just gives a little bit of grounding for our rooster. And all we have to do now is take a deep breath and get the tail feathers in. Oh, I tell you what we've got to do before we do that. Before we do that, it's helpful to put these little designs on, these sort of little dots that go along. It's almost like a leaf, you know, with the veins going either side. So if we put those on first, it helps give us some direction for where our feathers are going. There's a big one that comes out here, and the sort of like the center of it, and then coming either side of that, just like I said, like a leaf. There's sort of designs coming either side, and there's a few like little dots here and little dots here. Then there's another one coming out here. I want to kind of follow the photo a little bit so that I'm getting kind of a realistic style to it. I don't have to be super realistic, but if you get a little bit of realism, it helps with any abstract that you do after that, because it grounds your whole composition in something that people can recognize. If you want it to be impressionistic is what I mean, not sort of abstract, impressionistic. Put a few more of those dots on. A little bit more shadow still under here. There's quite a bit of shadow under there. I've got the medium brown on my brush now. These are a wet brush to just soften that in so it's not too harsh before I get to the tail feathers. So you want to have, I was saying that I'm going to use a number 8 brush. You don't want to go too big, but you don't want to go teeny either. And I'm going to use the dark brown I made. I made that dark brown with the sepia and the burnt sienna with a touch of ultramarine blue. And remember, not too much water, because we want this nice and dark. And start with the easy ones. Now these feathers here, you don't have to sort of do as much scary stuff with these ones. And you can go much more dramatic, I've got some here, than the photo. If you look at the pictures I sent you by Endre Penovac, you'll see that he goes super dramatic with the tail. It's totally impressionistic of how the tail goes. But, you know, take your brush, sweep, lift your brush so that you get a point on the end, and don't fuss. I want to get a slightly lighter brown, so I'm just getting one that's a little bit more burnt sienna. Sweep here, sweep. You know, you've got to get that direction just right. Go back to the darker brown. This one kind of curls round, up. And I'm going to be a little bit more dramatic than the photo. Point of your brush, if you lift your brush up and get the point of it, you have a nice thin tip that you can work with. And don't fuss. It doesn't matter if it's not like the photo. It's just your lovely brush strokes. They should have rhythm and movement to them. Just want a little bit more here. And if you put rhythm and movement into your brush stroke when you do it, you're going to have that effect in your painting, and it will be lovely. And just look at my shadow down here, and I have some of that brown on my brush right now, and I'm just going to put a little bit more down here because I always want to have an echo of a color somewhere else in the painting. I don't want it to be isolated just on the tail. The other place that there's quite a bit of shadow on the photo is where the two legs sort of cross here. So I'm going to get that brown and put a little bit more shadow here. Anytime you put a lovely dark color up against white or a light color, it makes the white sparkle so much more. I can take that shadow down this leg. Let's wash my brush so I haven't got too much paint on it, and make this little crease here a little darker, and then add some water so it's not too harsh. And just here's a couple more shadows I just want to put there. Again, into like pretty wet area that I've wet there. And wet under the wing too. And have a bit more shadow coming under the wing. I'm going to have to control that water, but that's what your brush is for. I've got all that wet on there, and I just need to use my brush to soak up a little bit of that water so it's not out of control. And I want a little bit more shading here, and some water. If you want something to look like a watercolour and not a photograph, you know, add some water. As long as you've got a brush and a Kleenex in your hand to control it, you should be okay. And don't forget that Endre has spent years and years and years painting roosters and cats, made a living out of it, and he's an expert because he has done so many. I'm sure his first ones were not that great. He's learnt by trial and error. Now, the other thing I'm just doing here is I'm wetting this and just dabbing it a little bit to get what's called some lost and found edges. So I've got a little bit of soft edge and then a little bit of hard edge, and again that gives a little bit of interest to the painting. I can do the same just here. Just soften that a little bit, and even here, just soften that area a little bit. These are little things you just do when you're finishing up. You're just putting on the finishing touches to your painting. So hopefully I've fixed the ending to that video that I lost, and I hope you enjoyed doing the rooster. Next week we'll do blue poppies, so we're going to get a break from animals and cats and everything else, but they are really fun to do. So thanks for joining me. See you again next time. Take care. Well, thank you for joining me again this week, and I hope your rooster turned out really well. Don't forget, I tried it 4 or 5 times before I was a little bit happy with how it turned out. It's a question of practice. See you again next week. We're going to do blue poppies. Bye for now.